In 2007, the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression exploded from the heart of Wall Street and contaminated the entire global economy. Reckless gambling, predatory lending, and outright fraud were endemic in some of the world's most powerful financial institutions. And now they were imploding.
The party is over. The era of golden parachutes for high-flying Wall Street operators is over.
In the UK, £131 billion of public money we didn't even have was handed to the banks. Financiers pocketed millions for their advice during the crisis, and the government has pledged a further £330 billion if the banks need it. The result? Britain's national deficit more than doubled.
Nobody wanted to be in a position where the government had to bail out the banking system. And when it happened, it was made very clear that we would try and exit that position as soon as possible. I think with some of the other government in the UK, government bailouts, it's going to take a little bit more time before we get to the right position on those. I mean, I'm not being an apologist for what happened, but I would put the argument back that the cost of the bailout essentially in the long run won't be that high. And when we've been through the reform process, we'll actually have a much safer, a much better capitalised financial system, which is better positioned to address growth in the economy going forward.
So there's been a few bits and pieces where you've seen people directly prosecuted as a result of what they were doing in the previous 10 years or so, the kind of corruption and fraud that was taking place there. What I'd say about it is that you haven't actually seen very much, not really, and the people you have seen prosecuted tend to be a little bit lower down the pecking order. You've not seen the really big people get done for any of this stuff. You've not seen the people overseeing the major banks, without naming names, the major banks during the boom. But what you have seen is some of the more junior traders, some of the people involved in setting the LIBOR rate, some of the people on trading desks who are just doing a bit of speculation. Relatively small-scale stuff. Part of the issue here, I suppose, is that it's not just a case that individuals are bad. You're talking about a whole system that's bad, and people are just behaving as part of that system.
And it's a system with a long history of crises, moving in a cycle of boom and bust. Austerity too has a long history. As a strategy to promote economic growth, it was pioneered in the global south, in Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Middle East. It has made and broken governments, upset international relations and transformed entire societies. In this episode, we take the story global and ask what lessons we can learn from that history and from abroad. Welcome to the Age of Austerity.
In practice, almost nothing has really changed of any great import. What I would say at the moment, particularly for the UK, is that we're starting to go and repeat the conditions that led to the crash last time round. So we're having a return, I think, to consumer debt, to rising levels of consumer debt. The banks themselves are getting back into a lot of the risky activity, not the same kind of risky activity, but similar risky activity to what they were doing prior to the crash last time round. The big danger here, of course, is that everyone, or at least banks, behave a bit like spoiled children, that if you don't punish them when they've done something wrong, and after 2008 they weren't punished, they were bailed out, they'll just carry on doing what they did before. And that's basically what's happening now. So we're kind of going through a lot of the same processes. Nothing fundamental is altered.
Was the bailout a mistake then?
Well, yes. It depends on who for. I mean, for the banks themselves, it was wonderful because you get away with it. There's a few casualties, but not really anything serious. For everyone else, yes, it was a mistake.
I think the point to make about the austerity and cuts agenda is it's not come out of nowhere. It's not come out of some sort of historical vacuum. It's part of a much broader project, which is popularly known as neoliberalism, which is an ideology which in theory promotes so-called free markets, though what it does in practice is a bit different, which is based on the transferring of public assets to the private sector. It's based on slashing taxes on the rich and on corporate interests. It's about rolling back collective organisation and workers' rights. It's about removing state intervention in the economy, which doesn't benefit private and corporate interests. And that's a project which goes back many decades.
The last Great Wall Street crash set the scene for the Great Depression and the rise of the Nazis in Germany. In the United States, thousands of banks collapsed, unemployment reached 75%, and millions went hungry.
Well, then you ought to know by this time the cardinal principle of business success is to get out from under while the going is good, and let the other fellow hold the bag.
But those good securities were all the poor woman had in the world. I couldn't ask her to exchange them for your bad stock after I'd given my word of honor.
Honor? What has honor to do with it? This is Wall Street.
Like today's Great Recession, there were those who blamed public spending on soup kitchens. But unlike today, the US government was confronted with massive pressure from a powerful labour movement. Workers staged hunger marches and industrial strikes. They made austerity politically impossible by demanding bread, not crumbs. President Roosevelt was forced to announce a New Deal.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credits and investments. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
Instead of making cuts, America did the opposite. It spent its way out of the Great Depression. Public construction created 8.5 million jobs. Secured loans saved over 1 million households from homelessness. Free immunizations, educational programs and food stamps lifted masses of people out of poverty and illiteracy. Incomes quickly rose, creating more jobs and rejuvenating the economy. The then president of the American Medical Association concluded that returns in economic and social welfare from expenditures on public health services were far in excess of their costs.
In the aftermath of World War II, those we now know as the neoliberals were seen as ideological pariahs. They were seen as defeated. They called themselves classical liberals. The experience of the Great Depression and World War II, with its huge use of wartime planning, totally discredited what was then known as laissez-faire economics.
In Britain, World War II was still raging when the Beveridge Report was published. It identified 5 giant evils in society: squalor, ignorance, want, idleness, and disease. Following a landslide Labour victory in 1945, its proposals became the basis for a national insurance scheme designed to provide basic health and security to all citizens, from the cradle to the grave. Despite a ruined economy and the largest public deficit in British history, the Great Reform was underway.
It's all yours, whenever you want it, with your own choice of doctor. And that goes for the whole family. The scheme is comprehensive. It's not only to help you when you're ill, but to help to keep you well. And of course, the younger generation will stand to gain the biggest benefits of all.
We ought to take pride in the fact that despite our financial and economic anxieties, we are still able to do the most civilised thing in the world, put the welfare of the sick in front of every other consideration.
When people came back from the war, they had won the war, but they were quite determined that they would win the peace when they came back. And that meant not going back to the terrible conditions between the two wars of social deprivation, people who went without health care, miners down the pits, lack of education, all those terrible things. They came back and they decided they were going to win the peace. So how is it that in 1948, when the NHS was started, when the country was in a terrible post-war slump with no money, we could create public services that we are now being told that we can't afford? You know, that is a disgrace in relation to the governments in this country. So what it meant for people was that for the first time ever, we cannot take away from people the fear of illness, even in these days when treatments are so much better than they were 60 years ago. What we have taken away from people for 60 years is fear of the financial consequences of being ill.
It's very important that we get out and fight this, because people of my generation, I think, take the NHS for granted. They think it's always going to be there because it's always been there. But, you know, it's so easy to forget that it hasn't always been there, and that loads of people had to fight very, very hard for it to be created. And we're going to have to fight very, very hard for it to be protected.
What became known as this social democratic consensus on welfare crossed party lines and national borders. It seemed set to become a cornerstone of modern civilization. But it was a defeat for the liberal economists, the predecessors of Milton Friedman, who believed not in collective but in individual responsibility. Men who looked at the welfare state and saw inefficiency, bureaucracy, and a culture of dependency amongst the poor. Men who believed in the market and maintained that greed and inequality were laws of nature.
If I'm going to do good with other people's money, I first have to take it away from them. That means that the welfare state philosophy of doing good with other people's money, at its very bottom, is a philosophy of violence and coercion. It's against freedom, because I have to use force to get the money.
What Milton Friedman, he was very right, very astute in what he said, which was that you'd only get radical change if there was a crisis. What was seen as the politically impossible would become the politically inevitable. So in the 1970s, when the Western economies went into crisis, you got a wave of inflation sweeping the Western world, you got a declining rate of profit, and this social democratic consensus, which both the Conservatives and the Labour parties upheld, that began to collapse.
As they did before the crash of 2007, in the early 1970s, neoliberal economists were proclaiming an end to the economic cycle of boom and bust.
Many of the things we hold dear are threatened as never before, but none has yet been lost. So stay here. Stay and help us defeat socialism.
By 1974, a downturn was in full swing. Still, they came to lead the world's most powerful governments. Ever since, wages have been in decline, and the financial sector, whose corruption and inefficiency Roosevelt had warned of, has dominated more and more of the global economy.
At the same time, you had an assault on working class institutions, the trade unions, which was the collective means of working class power and strength. Half of workers were unionised in 1979. It's now gone down to about a quarter. Sir Alan Budd, who this government appointed to the Office for Budget Responsibility, he was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And he said in the 90s that he worried that the policies he recommended weren't really about reducing inflation, but a good means of increasing unemployment, which was a useful means of defeating the power of the working class.
Rich countries have been telling the developing countries to adopt free trade and told them, look, I mean, all countries in history, probably with the possible exception of Japan, have become richer through free trade. So how do you think that you guys can manage it otherwise? Well, actually, if you look at the British history, American history, you find that today's rich countries used protectionism center, left, and right when they were developing countries. For about 1 century until the Second World War, the United States was actually the most protectionist country in the world.
Well, Latin America was the infamous testing ground of what we now know as neoliberalism. One of the first examples of it was when Augusto Pinochet overthrew Salvador Allende's democratically elected government in 1973 in Chile. And then you had all these other juntas across Latin America which enforced neoliberalism through the barrel of a gun, with torture chambers and people being dropped out of helicopters and mass murder, and they transformed those societies. And then even when you had democracy restored, neoliberalism continued.
With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, the neoliberals held the reins of the world economy while Russia found itself at a crossroads. As some called for a gradual transition to capitalism, shock therapy advocates won the day, and a massive programme of austerity and privatisation was introduced. Within 10 years, poverty skyrocketed to 40%, and a quarter of the population were living on less than $2 a day. With mass unemployment, the lives of 10 million Russian men were claimed by suicide, homicide, and alcohol poisoning. The Russian economy collapsed, while a few powerful men made millions from the sale of state assets.
I feel that even particularly within the contents of our education from a young age in this country, there's a sense of amnesia that develops. There's selectivity in the content that is passed on to young people. So the memory of the actions of British government, they're whitewashed essentially and completely romanticised.
This is a stark example of a pattern that has been repeated throughout the global south, where the human cost of austerity has been even greater than in the north. With Britain weakened by the Second World War, the winds of national liberation swept through its empire. Now, Western powers feared revolutionary uprisings in their former colonies that would be supported by the Soviet Union. Public investment in development and poverty alleviation were meant to pacify the people, but with the fall of the USSR, the West lost its incentive to invest in development, and with the rise of neoliberalism, the tide turned again.
The ones I call the terrible triplets are the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, that is trying to privatize and commoditize every human activity, all of the services, all of health and education, all of public services, transport, energy, water, etc.
Too often our responses to past crises have been inadequate or misdirected, promoting economic orthodoxies that we ourselves have not followed, and that have condemned the world's poorest to a deepening crisis of poverty.
A picture over the last 30 years that's similar. I mean, everywhere sort of goes through a similar process, but you get a more dramatic version of it in lots of places in the global south. In particular, with the debt crisis of the 1980s, where you had developing countries, Mexico, lots of places in sub-Saharan Africa, that ran into a really deep inability to repay the loans that they'd taken out. And then you get the IMF, which offers its assistance, it offers a bailout, but attached to that assistance is what gets called conditionalities.
Structural adjustment programs generally have 4 key conditions for international aid. Currency devaluation, which makes indigenous labour and resources cheaper for foreign companies. Liberalisation, which limits the power of government to regulate corporations. Funding cuts to social programs, particularly healthcare, welfare and education. And the privatisation of public enterprise, from the railways to the water supplies. In a word, austerity.
Because you impose austerity on the economy, you suck even more demand out, you drag the whole economy further down, and you end up with this very obvious failure on the part of the IMF to get anywhere.
Where levels of poverty are high, the ability to secure international aid or subsidise food and fuel is a matter of life and death for citizens and governments alike. With that aid conditional on submission to structural adjustment, many nations had little choice but to surrender control of their budgets to international aid agencies dominated by neoliberal Western states. Neoliberal economists promised southern states that the wealth being created would trickle down to the poor, but between 1960 and 1998, the income gap between the richest and poorest nations more than doubled. As their economies stagnated, the former colonies were forced to take on more and more debt and relinquish more and more control of their economies. By the 1980s, even World Bank economists spoke of a lost decade of development. And today, for every $1 sent to Africa in aid, 10 are lost through tax avoidance by the northern corporations empowered by austerity.
It's a desperate attempt to try and repay debts, to go through austerity like we're going through now, and at the same time make your country more kind of free market based and therefore, this is the idea, more efficient, more prosperous. So this gets imposed all over the place. It's a complete social and economic disaster, and it basically sets economic growth back in these places and therefore development back in these places by, well, as you look at the evidence now, by decades. What's happened since then, certainly since the late 1990s, is that you find increasingly in the South, countries are more able to ignore the IMF.
The growing importance of a financial sector dominated in turn by northern corporations, integrated national economies on their terms. Thanks to this process of globalization, when the latest financial crisis erupted, it rapidly contaminated the entire globe. Immediately, 46 million more people were pushed into poverty. Those living in impoverished countries whose social welfare systems had already been undermined by decades of structural adjustment were particularly vulnerable to external shocks, like the soaring prices of food and fuel. Anti-neoliberal protests erupted in Africa, and in the Middle East, these helped trigger revolutionary upheavals, long feared by the West.
So basically the poverty levels have gone so high until 2011, and since then until now we've been asking for the same demands: bread, freedom and social justice, because none of the governments, whether interim or military or brotherhood governments, have been able to fulfill the revolution demands. The poverty rates are going higher. I assume it's more than 40% of the Egyptian population are below the poverty line. So basically, the Egyptian revolution has not succeeded so far to achieve its demands.
Inequality both within and between nations has never been greater, and with the far right on the rise in Europe and elsewhere, communities are increasingly divided. In the next episode, we take a look at where those dividing lines are being drawn and ask if we are really all in it together.
This is a really fundamental battle about what the human experience should be, and currently for many people all over the world it's been reduced to a scrap, a fight for some crumbs. Well, we all know, in fact, there's enough for everybody to go around. So I think, if we don't see change, we're heading into a very dark time.